Yes. Okay. Great. So I wanted to welcome you all to tonight's this evening's conversation. We're talking about Resolution 1325 and gender and security policy. The event today is hosted by the International Institute for Peace, IAP, in cooperation with Women in International Security, Osce, as a partner here. So to thank you all for your interest and your attendance in this evening's event. My name is Patrick McGrath. I'm a project assistant here at the IIP, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. On the panel with me today are Angela KANE, who's the Vice President of the IIP and former UN High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Martin DEXBORG, who's advisor on gender issues at the OSCE, and CLARA BOHMAN, who's project manager and researcher at the WIIS here in Austria. So just to provide a brief context, so this panel discussion was actually spun out of a workshop that the IIP hosted in cooperation with Ponto last week. This workshop was focused on developing new ideas related to implementing and developing feminist foreign policies, policies that could be applicable across different fields and for different policymakers. If you're interested in contributing to the ideas coming from this workshop, the capstone is actually developing a collaborative policy paper. You can access this on Policy Kitchen. It's on policykitchen.com. So you can submit any ideas which will be attributed to you, and then the aim of this policy paper will be submitted to relevant decision makers. So if you're interested in this, we warmly encourage you to contribute. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to us after the event tonight. So to provide a brief context for what we're talking about today, so we're speaking about Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, which was passed by the UN Security Council 20 years ago. It was October in 2000. The resolution sought to bring attention to the role that women have in peace, peacekeeping, conflict resolution, conflict prevention, peace building, peace negotiations, post-conflict reconstruction, and a number of different issues related to peace and security generally. The initiative also called on all member states to further incorporate and involve women on an equal basis in peace and security efforts, to mainstream and incorporate gender perspectives into current initiatives, and finally to address special measures to counter gender-based violence that disproportionately affects women and girls in conflict, including rape and sexual assault. So today in the panel, we're looking to address 20 years after the passage of the resolution, to what degree have the stated aims and goals of the resolution been achieved or implemented? To what degree is gender involved or incorporated into peace and security making, policy-making decisions today? And what gaps remain, what needs to still be done maybe in the next decades? So the way the panel discussion will work today is the first 30 minutes will be dedicated to the three panelists. So we'll hear from each of them on the designated topic with a couple of follow-up questions. And then the second half of the discussion will be an open Q&A session open to all attendees. To contribute, to ask questions for the Q&A for the panelists, you can use the Q&A function that's in your Zoom screen. It's on the bottom tab, and you can type in questions there. So it'll all be by written. If you have questions that are for a specific panelist or for the panel generally, you can specify that. But we warmly encourage any participation, any questions you might have. You can also submit questions during the conversation while the panelists are speaking, which we'll address later if something comes up, or once we open up the Q&A session officially. You're also welcome to submit your questions then. So thank you again for your interest, and thank you to the panelists for coming this evening. So first we will hear from Angela KANE, who will be speaking about Resolution 1325 and its implementation. So Angela, the floor is yours.
Oh, you're done. So basically what happened is that this, of course, doesn't jump out of the thin air, this resolution, which was a very important milestone. But we have to remember also that there was a first women's conference in Mexico in 1975, and 5 years later you had another women's conference in Copenhagen, then in Nairobi in 1985, and then finally in Beijing in 1995. And I started working at the UN in the late 70s, and I will tell you, it was a very male-oriented world. And to many extent, it still is. But I was really delighted when this resolution was adopted, because I thought now it's actually going to be bringing women into the mainstream of the political work, of the peace building, the peace conflict resolution, prevention world, etc. Because it did have three aims, and those were to increase the participation of women at all decision-making levels in conflict prevention, conflict management, and peace building. So that was the first aim that this resolution established. And the second aim was to bring a gender perspective to peace operations and negotiations. Again, very important. And then the last one was to increase attention to the protection and respect on women's rights. And what I had witnessed then in the subsequent years is that most of the attention was really on the third part. And the third part was to focus on women as victims, to focus as women as sexual conflict victims, etc. And while it was a watershed in the international community, there was also a review conducted in 2015 to just basically say, how have we done this? How have we actually implemented this resolution? And while it did establish a very strong normative framework, I still very often now, even now, 20 years later, it's still looked through a development lens. And when you think about the follow-up, the 20 years that came afterwards, you had 8 additional resolutions that were adopted. There was one on peace building, there was one on women's participation in the substantive work in the UN and Security Council, but there were 5 of them that dealt with sexual conflict. And that is really, to my mind, it's a way of sidelining the really important work of giving women a seat at the table, giving a woman a seat in authority, giving a woman an input in terms of whether they can actually bring this. And this focus on sexual violence is really at the expense of the gender approach that informed the resolution. And it just created the impression that women were inherently vulnerable and they needed to be protected by men. And as a woman, I found that highly objectionable, I will tell you, because the elements for women to participate at the table of authority, of actually inputting into the negotiations, is really very, 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 very important. And to my mind, was really the most important one. And the implementation of this resolution has really been incremental. It's very selective. It's very selective by focusing on other issues, but it's really, how do we take the discourse from the talk to the action? I mean, how do you actually move this? We should move on the entire agenda and not only on part of it. And there's a lack of accountability, in my opinion, and it's not only for member states, but also for senior leaders in the United Nations, because the Women, Peace and Security agenda is always secondary to other really important political considerations and calculations. And that, to my mind, is one of the weaknesses of it. And again, let me stress that what is important is the normative framework of 1325. And sometimes language, when you read the language, it's very aspirational. It sort of says we're urging action and we are suggesting steps to be taken. So it's rather prospective rather than talking about the steps and the actions that have been taken and the implementation that has happened. And so what is missing here is when we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, we always talk about the indicators, the achievements, the milestones. And that, to my mind, is something that is very much missing in 1325. Where are the milestones? Where are the indicators? Where's the accountability for moving forward on this issue? And I find that when you look at the Security Council dealing with the gender, it's always dealt with in a silo. And you see reprisals against women human rights defenders. You see reprisals against women peace builders. You see trafficking in persons a lot, sexual violence and conflict, as I mentioned. And so this is usually the debate that takes place in October every year. And that, to my mind, could really be much improved by making it more muscular. But I think there's a lot of pushback because everyone says, yes, this is very important, but not everyone really talks the talk. It talks the talks, but doesn't walk the walk. And even though this is dealt with once a year, it really is done in such a way that it doesn't reverberate throughout the rest of the system. And that, to my mind, is something where the United Nations and the senior officials and the Secretary General, who has done a lot for women in general, really has much more of a responsibility to also bring that to bear. But I think that we have to look at the positive side of 1325, and that is that it has created an awareness of this issue that is really very, very strong. And I would hope that this awareness will further grow, and also with the good work that's being done, there's more attention paid to this issue. I mean, for example, Martin is a gender advisor. I mean, I'm not quite sure that's your title, but we have gender advisors in peacekeeping missions. But to my mind, what is missing is not only that these people who are advisors advise, but they have to have authority to actually take action. They actually have executive authority to put something through, because advising, you can advise, but that doesn't mean that your advice is taken seriously or that it's being implemented. And that, to my mind, is one of the major drawbacks at this post, because you have gender advisor in the OSCE, you have it in NATO, you have it at the EU, you have it at the African Union, you're everywhere. But so what impact have those gender advisors really made? And I don't mean to say that they're not doing good work, but they aren't always given the power, the authority, and the remit to actually force action on certain parts. Let me stop here and come back a later time.
Okay, great. Angela, I have a couple of follow-up questions for you just quickly. So the first one is, how would you characterize the impact of Resolution 1325 specifically on peacekeeping operations and the role of women in peacekeeping operations in the UN? And then secondly, you spoke about sort of the different ways in which Resolution 1325 has been implemented in different areas. And I wonder, specifically in decision-making, which you mentioned is an area that's maybe more lacking, do you have any ideas of how how women's involvement in decision-making could be better measured, or how it could be held more accountable to move beyond sort of words and actually kind of create action in this space?
Well, talking about the role of gender advisors, I will tell you, and I've served in peacekeeping operations, and a gender advisor is something, it's like a must. It's like a mantra. We have to have a gender advisor in a peacekeeping mission. However, that person very often has no power. And when it comes to giving advice on gender, or maybe making some recommendations for implementation by the senior leadership that don't really go with the flow of the political consideration at the time, it's being pushed aside. So meaning it's not given the precedence of leading a certain dialogue, but rather it is an add-on. And if it's convenient, it's basically taken. But on the other hand, if it's not convenient, it's just shoved aside. And the person is really very frustrated. And that, to my mind, is one of the major drawbacks of all of this. And when it comes to the senior leadership, I have, for example, I've never had a woman boss at the UN in my 37 years of being there. I would have dearly liked to have one. But there's an extremely strong impetus going out from seeing a woman in the corner office and a woman having the decision-making authority and the power to actually make things happen. I have always hired a lot of women. And what you find that very often a lot of the leadership in peacekeeping in particular is still very male. And I think that there is a difficulty that sometimes it's hard for a woman to be in a leadership position if you're serving in very, very difficult positions. And again, I've served in Ethiopia and Eritrea, I've served in the Congo, I've been in Jakarta, but not in peacekeeping. So basically, it's very difficult for that. And you have to have a pretty strong, let's say, willpower to actually make this happen and to lead people. I mean, I was in charge of a peacekeeping operation as a deputy, and that had over 5,000 people. That is something that is really very, very difficult, because you have to be pretty self-confident to actually do that, and to have, over 600 civilians also, in addition to the military. But on the other hand, I find it extremely important, because how do you learn leadership as a woman? How do you learn how to lead? How do you learn how to set an example to others? You do that because you learn from others. And I've been very fortunate, because I have served with high-ranking senior officials who actually showed me how it's done, because that's, you observe, you see how it's happening. So my position has always been, if you want to support women, put women in a position where they can observe, particularly in the political field, which is not something, yes, you can study it, but that does not mean that you can actually exercise this. I mean, you have to watch what's happening. And that is really important when you watch how political negotiation, political conflict prevention, or conflict settlement is being done. I was very lucky in that, but not everyone has that chance. So I think that you have to have a proactive movement also to steer women that are, have good potential, to steer women in certain directions, to actually give them the opportunity to learn.
Okay, great. Thank you, Angela. So we'll return back in the audience Q&A session. So next we hear from Martin DEXBORG, who will be speaking about the OSCE approach to gender mainstreaming and current practices. So Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Just a few kind of comments on Angela's presentation. I agree. I mean, I also served both in Congo and Indonesia and many other peacekeeping places. And yes, there are some issues with marginalization of gender advisors, for sure. I would say it has become quite much better. When I started off 15 years ago, 2005, there were no gender advisors at all. There was no gender architecture. Over the years, it has increased. And I would say today it would be impossible to launch any mission, both for the UN, OSCE, and the EU, without having gender advisors deployed. Now, as an advisor, I mean, obviously our job is not to implement things. We advise. That's in the title, right? So it's up to management to implement things that are in management, what are in the mandate, which has been given to them by the participating states. So we think they need to know sort of who does what. But anyhow, OSCE. Okay, so the world's largest regional security organization, 57 member states, from Canada to Russia and pretty much anyone in between. Based on a human rights principle, so gender equality has been part of our core mandate from the beginning. But I would say it was not until 1999 that the first time we employed a full-time gender advisor. That is one person. Today, we're 10 people working full-time here in the Secretariat in Vienna. And then we also have 2 people in Ukraine and 1 in Kosovo. So it is increasing. And again, we see the same trends in other international organizations as well. Now, what do we do when it comes to our commitments? I mean, first of all, our key document or key mandate was adopted in 2004, so 4 years after 1325. And we call it our Gender Action Plan. And that has 3 components. One is we should do work internally. So it's about recruitment, having more women working for OSCE, like we just heard. But for many years, OSCE, like many other security organizations, has mainly been staffed by men. Where are we today? I would say amongst ordinary staff, phrase it like that, it's about 50-50 men and women working in OSCE. When it comes to middle management, the number of women drops to about 30%. And when it comes to senior management, it's 50-50 again. Well, Secretary General is a man. We never had a female Secretary General. That will hopefully change eventually. Our biggest issue with recruitment, I would say, are in our mission in Ukraine, where it's about 20% women deployed in the field. And that's part of the reason is because it's the participating states, our members, that are nominating staff. And as OSCE as an organization, we can only do so much if we don't get to the right amount of female nominees from our participating states. When it comes to the direct recruitment, which is being done by OSCE, we do much better. We're still lagging behind, specifically when it comes to heads of missions in our field operations, where very few are women. So that's something we certainly need to work more on. We have adopted what we call a gender parity strategy last year, which has set a target. Angela, you mentioned lack of indicators and accountability. Our target now is by 2026, we should have reached gender parity in all sections, in all departments. We're not there yet, but let's see. Hopefully we will get there. Leadership accountability. Yes, also since last year, all managers working for OSCE, they are now have mandatory in their what we call a performance management objectives. They have to report on what have they done on advancing gender equality. So that's the internal work. Our, let's say, more external work is, well, all of our projects, what we're doing. Let's say we do something in Southeastern Europe related to getting rid of small arms and light weapons in society. Then we need to incorporate a gender perspective into that. So let's say looking into the nexus between small arms and light weapons and domestic violence. or we might be working on cybersecurity. And we need to look into the nexus, gender aspects of that. It could be, for instance, trafficking. Or we're working on counterterrorism issues, where we need to make sure that both men and women are included in the process, in the part we're running, but also in our guidelines, look into, for instance, gender dynamics of recruitment policies from extremist groups. How do we explicitly support the implementation of the peace and security agenda? Well, one of the things we do mentoring programs together with our participating states. For instance, in North Macedonia, the number of female police officers are generally very low in OSCE, about 16%. So that's why we're running these mentoring programs as a way of trying to both increase the number of women in the security sector, but also keep them. I mean, retainment, it's about changing work policies as well. But again, that's done in collaboration with our participating states. This year, we launched a research report where we looked into national action plans on 3025. That's one of the, I would say, the core documents that the participating states are having in order to measure how do they do when it comes to implementation on the Women, Peace and Security agenda. In OSCE, about 60% of our participating states has a national action plan, and it's increasing. We have, for the last 7 years in the Secretariat, been running various workshops and training events for participating states and civil society members in order to facilitate the work of, let's say, trying to make the action plans more results-oriented and also have a stronger monitoring and evaluation framework. And I would say civil society is key to that process, because due to having civil society represented at the table, the security service actors tend to be much more focused on, how do we actually measure what hasn't been done and what needs to be done, not necessarily only report on achievements to this day. Well, what are the challenges? I would say one of the challenges in the national action plans is that there's a lack of budget. 85% of in the participating states that has an action plan, which means 36, do not have a budget, or it's a very limited budget. So it's almost like you would say, implementing the Women, Peace and Security agenda is important, but it doesn't have to cost any money, which is, clearly highly problematic. I think I totally agree with Angela there. There is a need to strengthen both gender advisors and gender focal points, and also to professionalize, I would say, the profession, and not to necessarily rely on people's goodwill and voluntary work. It needs to be seen as any other profession. We're in the Secretariat. We will try to, depending on now the COVID-19 situation, but we're planning to run a couple of capacity building sessions for participating states later this year, where we'll again go through the results of this report and try to look into what support can OSCE do and how can we further strengthen the architecture of the National Action Plan. I think I will stop there, and I'm very much looking forward to the Q&A.
Okay, great. I have one follow-up question for you, Martin. Thank you for your presentation. How would you kind of position the OSCE and other regional organizations in terms of the implementation of Resolution 1325 and then sort of gender mainstreaming generally? Sort of like, how do you see its strengths and weaknesses in comparison to international organizations or the member states that you guys are working with? What do you think the regional organizations can offer to this specifically?
Well, I mean, I work for the UN, I work for the EU, and now I work for the OSCE. And I would say, in general, I mean, it's relatively similar. There has been progress. There is work to be done. There needs to be, first, it needs to be clearly defined as well, the whole Women, Peace and Security agenda. I mean, the first pillar, it's quite clear. I mean, increasing the number of women working with peace and security and getting women to the table. That's very relatively easy because you can measure it, you have indicators for that. The other aspects, the prevention and the protection part, it is not necessarily very clearly conceptualized. And I think that's something each organization themselves needs to work on, including us.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you again, Martin. So we'll now move on to CLARA. So last we'll hear, so this is CLARA BOHMAN, who was speaking about civil society and the WPS agenda. So CLARA, on to you.
Hi, everyone, and big thank you to the IIP for co-organizing this with us and also letting us from Women in International Security speak. Giving civil society a voice in this subject is, of course, very important. I will address a topic that Martin just started to talk about and Angela also addressed, the indicators for measuring the implementation of the UN Resolution 1325. But also, I think when talking about the national action plans, and this is just before I start what I want to talk about, to Martin, I think when looking at the national action plans, a big problem that we see, especially, for example, in Austria's national action plan of the UN Security Resolution 1325, is that women's issues and gender balance are often equalized with each other. And this is a big conceptual mistake that is made in this discourse. Before I start talking, I just want to make sure that we all operate with the same definition in order for the participants then in the Q&A to actually talk about the same thing. I'm working with the UN Office of Disarmament Affairs definition here. So gender as such is defined as the social attributes and opportunities associated with being male and female, as well as relationships between women and men, girls and boys. Gender determines what is expected, allowed, and valued in a woman or man in a given context, as opposed to women's issues, which are broadly addressed in the resolution, which are issues often linked to rights of other vulnerable groups, such as children, elderly, and disabled. I think we could talk about many topics when talking about the implementation. I'm going to focus on the civil society. And I'm arguing that we need to rethink security policy. We need to get away from, and maybe I'm doing this from an idealist perspective because I have not worked in the field for 15 or 20 years and I don't have as much practical experience. But I would say from a theoretical standpoint, it's immensely important to rethink the security policy away from a masculinized, militarized security policy towards a security policy that is underlying a feminist approach. This needs to be done, I'm going to tell you, out of two reasons, in my opinion. The first being, if this is not done, the NGOs do the work that should actually be done by governments or other organizations. If we look in COVID times, the pandemic, into crisis and conflict situations, we can look towards the Democratic Republic of Congo, Syria, Myanmar, Ukraine. What we see, and also in Europe, is a highly militarized discourse. It is talked about us being in war against COVID-19 instead of actually concentrating on an inclusive, equal, and solidarity-steered discourse. This brings us to see that the priorities of security policy today doesn't really include gender perspectives, which results in the fact that certain problems arise, such as, for example, police forces using their resources and forces to address people not adhering to quarantine measures, for example, instead of actually looking towards what is happening behind closed doors. People being beaten almost beaten to death in quarantine situations, and this topic is not addressed by police forces. We have reporting on this from women peace activists in Ukraine, for example. And the lack of responses, adequate responses to issues arising due to a lack of a gender perspective, such as domestic violence, inequality in economic empowerment. We see a lot of women losing their jobs, proportionately more women than men, due to Corona. And also no space being given to care work at home and care work in hospitals for women, that these issues are not addressed by the people who should actually address them, namely the governments, leads us to the importance of civil society and NGOs. These topics and issues that I just addressed, and I think Angela made a good point there with the sexual violence aspects in the resolution, is always something mirrored and portrayed as women's issues. So thereby they're separated and made to a subcategory, not part of the issues that the security forces concentrate on. There is also a big part of security discourses that circulate around the resilience of women and women in peace building. Women are expected to pick up the pieces after conflict. Women peace builders are not adequately funded because they are doing their job anyways, and they will do a good job. And this is not a long-term solution. Which leads me to the fact that NGOs just step in here. They contribute with information, data gathering on the needs of vulnerable groups such as minorities, elderly, internally displaced people, especially in times of COVID-19. But especially also, the distribution and provision of information on the needs of people. They serve as a link between the society and the government, which is immensely important. But this leads me to the second point, that unless the security policy as it is today is not reformed and rethought, especially the definition of security, to underlie a feminist approach, the implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 will not be as effective as we would hope for. When we look at the current discourse on how civil society can contribute to the implementation of the resolution, it is a highly technocratic discussion. The discussion focuses on what kind of indicators there are to measure it. You mentioned it too, Angela, and I think it's an important point to make. We need to look at indicators and we need to look at measurements, but the current discussion is leaving too much room for technocratic aspects and problematizing the comparison between countries and the measurability, and fails to address the fact that gender roles are strengthened and reproduced by the resolution, thereby strengthening the differences, the societal and normatively attributed differences between men and women. Women are regarded as more peaceful. The women victim paradigm is not something new in the UN Resolution 1325. And rather than being active and equal participants in peace and security contexts, we are seen as people that can contribute to mediation or women's activities in post-conflict situations, but we're not seen as equal. And thereby, I just want to conclude by saying that we have to move away from this exclusive security policymaking into an inclusive one. We have to take this momentum of the corona crisis and look beyond just simply stopping the pandemic, and just take this momentum and rethink narratives, policies that are at stake, the resolution itself, and especially the definition of security. Thank you.
Thank you, Clara. One quick follow-up question. So you spoke about sort of what role civil society organizations play in the implementation of the resolution. What do you see as sort of the greatest strength of these organizations? What do you think that civil society organizations can contribute to the implementation? You mentioned, for instance, narratives. Do you think that these organizations can change the way that these things are discussed, or kind of set the agenda? What do you see as their sort of greatest role?
I mean, I personally think that all the four pillars of the resolution can be strengthened through NGOs, because we as civil society organization, not being bound to governments and to bureaucratic aspects, we have a great potential in mobilizing people. So mobilizing people from all different political spectrums, for example, and then B, collecting data in the form that we wish for. We don't need to adhere to certain rules, but we can collect data from within the field. by people on the grounds, and thereby, so I think the black on white data collection thing, and also the mobilization, we have a great potential to pressure and lobby for our aims to governments, and thereby maybe influencing the way national action plans are supposed to look like, and also how they can be changed. That's where our core potential lies, I think.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so in just a minute, we're going to open up to a public Q&A session. So for those of you who might have joined late, you can submit your questions by writing in the Q&A section, which you can see on the bottom of your Zoom screen. So if you have any questions now, we warmly welcome any. In the meantime, the panelists, is there anything that you all might have wanted to respond to something that another of the panelists said, or Angela Martin, for example, or is there anything you guys would like to?
Yeah, let me come in here, because I think that we're all pretty much on the same page as far as, you know, saying yes, we welcome resolution, but there needs to be a lot of work that still needs to be done. And one of the practical aspects that kind of resonates with me particularly is when Martin also talked about the capacity building, which I think is one of the issues that can easily be done in terms of, I think you mentioned the police in Macedonia, if I remember. And I was involved in the peace negotiations in El Salvador, and this was basically the war between the guerrillas and the government. And it was a matter that the police was wholly militarized. They had 3 branches of the police, and they all kind of were interchangeable with the police. And I was in charge of a team that basically was devising a new platform for the police, meaning a civil police, a civil national police. And it was fascinating because it basically meant going down to El Salvador and negotiating. But what I absolutely insisted on is that the women had to be represented in the police force. And that is something that, I'm not saying a man couldn't have done it, but it's something that had not been mentioned before. And I was very insistent that we have to have women in the police force. And we have to be away from these military-style uniforms for the police. They have to be a little bit more accessible to the population. I felt that was very important, that they had to wear like a white blouse and a dark blue skirt or dark blue pants or something like that. And that was very, very hard to fight through, because the government at the time did not want that. The guerrillas did want it. And that, again, I think is very important, because that's where like civil society comes in. And I'm glad that, you know, CLARA was talking about that, because there are suggestions and there's an impetus going out to that can be very, very strong. Because I think that civil society today is not what it was 50 years ago. It's much, much stronger. It's much more assertive, and it has a much more of a megaphone, if I can call it that, also with social media. So thank you for that.
Okay, all right, so we'll start with the questions. So the first question we received, this is addressed for Martin, and it says, how does the OSCE link to the EU, if at all, in terms of implementing national action plans and regional action plans? So if you could discuss maybe a little bit how sort of these organizations collaborate on these issues.
Yeah, no, I mean, EU, they have their own, framework and various documents that applies obviously to the EU. In OSCE, we do not have that in the same way. I mean, let's say, well, in order for the organization to make any decisions, we have to have consensus of 57 participating states, and that doesn't always happen. So we do not have the same framework as the EU in this sense. However, I would say we have a very close collaboration with EU on many topics related to gender. We participate in each other's events. We have also more about a technical, exchange with what we call a lot of acronyms, the RAR, the Regional Acceleration on Resolution 3025. It's basically gender advisors like myself dealing with other gender advisors in the EU mission and discuss, common challenges, exchange of training materials and so on. So, and in general, I would say in the more sort of high-level meetings, it's all more often than not, you would see, the senior gender people from EU, various UN organizations, and OSCE, as well as from participating states in the same room. So there is, I would say, within the gender community, quite a lot of exchange and collaboration between all the international organizations.
Okay, great. And the next question, which I guess is directed to the whole panel, was from the chat. Someone asked, what does an ideal national action plan look like? So maybe you could discuss what things might be missing, or if you have any specific country case studies that could be discussed in this case, maybe for example for Austria or others, if any panelists have a response to that.
Yeah, who?
Sorry, I can come in here. I mean,
Okay.
I don't think that there's any one, action plan that is applicable, because I think there are various levels on which action plans are developed. And one of them is the national action plan in terms of, let's say, political participation. Like in some countries, women were given the vote very late. I mean, I don't want to single out one country, but Switzerland, women got the vote in 1971. Can you imagine that? 50 years ago. I mean, that's a long time in coming. And Saudi Arabia, so this is the political participation. That's one of the things. And then if you think about that, is even though women are just over half of the population in this world, there are only 3 countries in this world where women have a majority or more than 50% of the national legislature. And that's Bolivia, Cuba, and Rwanda. And, right now you have just over 10% of the 193 countries. I mean, there's like 21 countries that have a woman head of state or head of government. So political participation is really, really important in terms of giving women the space to participate in the political life. And then, of course, you have another issue, and that is the one that CLARA also talked about, and that is the women as victims. The whole issue of the rights that women have. In some countries, for example, they also don't have the social and democratic rights. They may not be able to own property, for example. So, there's a whole gamut of actions that would need to be taken, and maybe some countries focus on some of them, and maybe some focus on all of them. And maybe some member countries already have a lot of these participation and protection rights that women have. So it's very, very different from one country to the other. It really depends on where is the country at this particular stage in time.
Yeah, can I just maybe say something on this ideal? There is not really any ideal national action plan. It has to be very context bound. I mean, adapted to what specifically country concerned and the context. And I think one thing we have seen when we look into them is that some action plans are very narrow. They have a very defined topic. For instance, increasing women in the security sector. And like Clara said, well, when you have indicators of things very technical. Well, that's true. And one thing which is good, because then it's easier to measure success. Of course, the issue is it doesn't tackle the broader aspects like you discussed, gender inequality in general, gender stereotypes, the overall peace-building framework. However, if you have it too broad as well, I mean, it's also hard to measure something. You might have something which has a lot of good intentions, but you have no really way of advancing it. So my answer would be that you really need to look into what is applicable to that specific country and what do you want to achieve. And then again, whatever you do want to achieve, I think there still is a need to have a very clear monitoring and evaluation framework so you can actually follow progress.
I would personally say that, first of all, as I said before, the problem with Austria's national action plan is that the introduction is putting gender equality equal to women's issues, which is just simply wrong. So this cannot be part of a national action plan, to be honest. However, they need to be regularly updated, of course, and apply and answer to the needs of, for example, peace workers in the field. Austria's national action plan was updated latest 2012, and we see countries as Switzerland, who already has their 4th update of their national action plan. Furthermore, a point that I think is important is that it needs to be inclusive with an allocated budget and also basically comprehensively applied to all areas related to security. And the update is another factor. The gender equality, like the terminology, I think is important. And the update, I think, is very important. And then listening to people in the field.
Okay, great. So the next question is actually 3-part and may actually touch on what all 3 of you said. So this question says, to Angela, you mentioned that the resolution lacks indicators and goals. As far as I'm concerned, it is difficult to point out specific aims with regard to gender. What do you think? What could those indicators be? And how should the resolution be amended? Secondly, to whom it may concern, does anyone have any experience from the Balkans, especially Bosnia and Herzegovina or Kosovo, in the implementation of Resolution 1325? And lastly, what's the situation with gender-based violence committed by UN peacekeepers? How does the resolution deal with issues such as this? So if any of you guys want to start.
There are a number of recommendations that were made. They were actually quite far-reaching. There was a report that came out in 2015 that basically looked at the first decade or decade plus of implementation of 1325. And as I said, 1325 has very specific aims. It doesn't cover the whole gamut. It doesn't talk about national action plans. It's a more of an aspirational, this is what we would like to have. And as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to indicators, you can put in some of the indicators because the rights of women are not all equal throughout the world, as I already mentioned. But on the other hand, when it comes to women participation, particularly in the substantive part of women being involved in conflict resolution, conflict settlement, etc., you can basically have a quota system. I think Martin was the one who already mentioned the quota system. I will tell you frankly, I was always very much against quotas in the United Nations because you don't want to be a quota woman. You don't want to be promoted to a place or be in a place because you're a woman, because you want to be recognized on your own merits. But let me tell you one thing, I've changed my mind. I think quotas are a good thing. Quotas work. And look at the Nordic countries, for example. I mean, quotas work. Where do you have a lot of participation of women in the political work? You have Sweden declaring a feminist foreign policy. Quotas work. So if you want to have an indicator of how do you involve women in peacekeeping, prevention, etc., then you basically must have women at the table. And that goes for the UN as well. It's not only for countries. But unfortunately, there's a lot of pushback because you have also very, very conservative-minded governments, and they are not in agreement with this. So I cannot really see where the Security Council would have very, very strong indicators binding on themselves, where actually they would say that, yes, we are willing to do X, Y, Z, we are willing to send women negotiators to the table, we're doing this. So it's going to be a very hard slog. But on the other hand, we've had 20 years of this, and what we have now is we have a different situation. 20 years later, there is a norm that has developed, and it's much harder to push back on it than it was 20 years ago.
Does either of the other panelists want to touch on any of those?
No, just to say that, I mean, in the Western Balkans, the overseas field missions are in several of the countries working by invitation of the government in various forums in terms of reviewing their national action plans on 1325 or other gender equality plans that the government is adopting. I don't really know the details, but I know it's a kind of ongoing work in some of the countries. And yes, I agree with Andy. I mean, sometimes quotas obviously do work, and some countries have had quite some success with quotas. Being Swedish myself, I mean, in Sweden, we don't really use quotas most of the time, but we have done, I would say, fairly well anyway. So again, it depends on them. But I think when it comes to the involvement of women in the security sector, it also follows the general, let's say, development of gender equality in the country in itself. So I think it's fair to say that in countries which, there's in some countries there's more need for quotas than others, we'll put it like that.
I just want to add to that, Martin, also being Swedish myself, the quotas, I mean, we have to look at competency-based quotas and quotas that are simply there and are distracted from competence. So there are two different forms of quotas, but competency-based quotas did actually exist in Sweden, but that was in the 70s. So we were very early with it. And I think that's the reason why we don't need quotas anymore, because now we already have women in representation.
Can I just come in here for a minute? And basically, what I think that you have quotas in certain aspects. For example, you, Clara, talked about Austria. Austria has quotas for women be sitting on boards of companies. So does Germany, so does some other countries in the European Union. Have they ever been fulfilled? Never. I think the quota is supposed to be 30%, and right now in Austria, if I'm well informed, it's like 8%. Now there's a problem here, because you can have quotas, but then if you don't have somehow an obligation to follow through to them, they're not worth the paper they're written on. The UN had quotas always for women in senior positions for years, for decades, and it was never reached. The General Assembly would set quotas and say, you need to reach. It never was reached. So unless there is some kind of a consequence for not fulfilling the quotas, then they are toothless. There's no accountability there.
Can I just comment on that? Yes, and again, but just coming back to the also OSCE, we have set certain targets, and we do not use quotas in OSCE. And many times people are thinking we do. But I would say most often we have enough, talented people who happen to be women who are qualified for positions. So there is clearly a pool to draw from. And as I mentioned, when it comes to our directors now, which we for the first time has reached gender parity, what we did also in 2018 for a while. But it is possible, I think, for some organizations to reach gender parity without a quota system, with targeted recruitment, outreach, and so on. Okay,
great. Okay, so I have two next group questions. So the first one is directed specifically to CLARA. It says, you talked a lot about gender being a subcategory and often being narrowly defined as women's issues. How does this impact civil society organizations, and how have you experienced this? And then the second question that is for the whole panel, dealing with the current situation, says, do you think the current situation regarding the coronavirus crisis will disproportionately affect security of women in developing countries? And I wonder if you can also, I could expand to generally how you might suspect the ongoing pandemic might impact the implementation of the resolution and a possible kind of anti-globalization wave that may come from this. Whoever would like to answer that first.
I could maybe just start by answering the question directed to me. As an actor in a civil society NGO actor, I definitely think we work in Vienna, and our group is comprised out of international relations expert. Most of us are young women. We have had one man out of 10, I guess. But we face this problem a lot. We are put in the subcategory of women's issues. And the problem that arises is we are very rarely invited to, I think someone else's microphone is on because I can hear myself in another. Anyhow, yeah, thank you. We're very rarely, even though some of us are really specialized on security issues, such as cybersecurity, trafficking in human beings, other security issues, we are very rarely invited to speak at security events, very rarely invited to peacekeeping events. We are put as an organization that works on women's issues, and therefore we are invited to gender events, women's rights events. And this is very frustrating because it leaves us operating within the same bubble. I mean, I don't know how many times I've heard both Angela and Martin speak, but this is a very frustrating observation. Yes. Maybe someone else wants to start answering the next question, and I will just think of an answer to the next question.
The next question was COVID affecting women?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think COVID affects everyone. It's like it's whether it's man, woman, child, it doesn't really matter. It affects us all. Does it affect women disproportionately worse than it does men in developing countries? I think when you look at many of the developing countries where women are not the wage earner, where they are mostly the person who stays at home. I'm thinking, for example, what happened with HIV/AIDS. Women were primarily the victims of HIV/AIDS in terms of being at the mercy of catching the disease. But again, my viewpoint of looking at Resolution 1325, and that is our topic here today, is I don't really want to see 1325 through a lens of women being victims. To my mind, I would like to see women as being the doers, the makers, the shakers, the ones who have a seat at the table and who weigh in on the conversation. And when you look at COVID, there was an article in Forbes magazine 2 weeks ago. And basically it was very interesting because it sort of says, what do countries with the best coronavirus responses have in common. And that was women leaders. And what did they say? They said it was Germany, it was Taiwan, it was New Zealand, it was Iceland, Finland, Norway, and Denmark. So there you got it. But I would like to see 1325 to sort of say, women are really good at running things. They're really good at putting security, whatever it is they can do. And they just need to be given the chance to participate fully in the life. So I don't want to see 1325 through the third pillar, which is the women as victim, but rather through the first pillar as women as actors and proactive involvement in peace and security issues.
Yeah, I totally agree with Angela. I mean, I think it's important to also focus on them, not only as women as victims, because it's very easy to slide into that narrative. And I think one of the things that needs to be looked upon afterwards is what role did actually women play in, for instance, in crisis response teams, the people that does all the planning when it comes to COVID action. Was it both men and women involved in the decision-making process? And if not, why was that the case and what was missed? Because I think it is important to, the whole core of the 1325 would be that, women and men needs to be at the table, both of them, both groups. And I think many times that's not the case. So I would say we need to really do a proper gender analysis afterwards when we have seen what was the COVID response.
I just wanted to shortly add to that, that of course women in developing countries where gender inequality tends to be higher are more affected by the outcome of the COVID-19 pandemic than in developing countries. The more, the less space you have to live on, the less hygienic standards you have in a country, the more domestic violence, the less gender inequality overall, the more affected you are by the crisis. So, and especially, as I said, with internally displaced people, as it tends to be in conflicting areas and also in developing countries, internally displaced people suffer the most under COVID-19, and that includes the women in internally displaced situations.
Okay, all right, so we'll have our last two questions here. One question asks, how can national governments be incentivized to tackle the issue of reproducing gender roles and feminist goals when most conflicts nowadays are with non-state forces who are not equally answerable to the same degree in women's issues? And then a second question is we focus a lot on security. Sorry, can you hear? Yeah.
Can you just take the question or the second part of the question a bit slower?
Yeah, sorry. So how can national governments be incentivized to tackle this when most conflicts are with non-state forces who are not equally answerable to the same degree on women's issues? And then the last question, we talked about the public health and COVID-19 issue. So to what degree, in light of this, have you seen the goals of Resolution 1325 maybe going beyond peace and security and conflict resolution to areas like public health or environmental issues and climate change or economics? Have these sort of issues gone to different international organizations or different areas? If you could comment on that, and those are your last questions.
Let me start. I think the question about the non-state forces or the irregular forces is a very good one. Because there is really no accountability in terms of who is on the table, and I think it makes it very difficult. And I'm just thinking about all of the negotiations that mediation negotiation that the United Nations has done with regard to the Syria question, and they basically insisted that women had to have a seat at the table, and it was very, very difficult. And think about Libya, for example. When you think about the negotiations, the mediation that is going on there, very, very hard to get women to the table. And when you bring in irregular forces, when you bring in non-state actors, then basically the accountability is not there. And also, I think we all like to think of ourselves as good actors. We want to have women at the table. We want to give equal opportunity. And we would like to see this agenda realized. But not everyone has the same agenda. Not everyone believes that. And so there's no accountability on the part of those forces. So that's a very good point that one needs to keep into mind. So how do you hold their feet to the fire in that sense? That, to my mind, is something that's very difficult, because the irregular forces or the non-state actors, they usually come out of the fighting. They come out of the war that CLARA was talking about. So that's where they're coming from. So how do you actually channel that into a different direction? And I think that that is very, very difficult. And then when it comes to the other question that was raised about the public health, I mean, I really would like not to see that everyone in the kitchen sink is being put under 1325. You know, let's leave public health out of the 1325. Let's leave 1325 what it is. And public health can be dealt with in a different manner, but not to kind of pile everything into it, because I think it detracts from the very good structure that 1325 has and the focus that it has, by putting in extra issues that maybe are easier to handle or easier for governments to address than it is than the underlying question of giving women a seat at the table in conflict prevention and in peace negotiations.
I just wanted to say to the non-state actors that I think it's just clear for governments to be incentivized towards dealing with any threat that comes, external threat, in a democratic manner. And as long as women are not represented in dealing with this, then it's not democratic, first of all. And second of all, government and international community as such need to hold armed groups or terrorist groups or non-state actors accountable for things like gender-based violence. And that's basically what I think would be incentivizing. And coming to the public health, I agree with Angela that we should keep it outside of the UN Security Resolution 1325. But I would also say that if we just follow my advice and rethink the definition of security as such and give it a more feminist approach, aspects of physical security and things in public health will be gendered anyways related to security, so there is no need to put these aspects under 1325.
Martin, did you want to add something, or
yeah, but maybe, I mean, CLARA, yes, you're right. I mean, we need to look into what we mean with security. I mean, various fears, we don't really know yet, but various fears that, for instance, there'll be, during the people are in lockdown, there will be an increase in domestic violence, which obviously would affect women more than men, and that is a security problem, hence something which would fall under 1325. Same thing, for instance, in most countries. I mean, it's not only about developing countries. I would say most countries, women has normally the primary care responsibility, which means if women already start working in the security sector and now schools are closed, women have to be home, and it's more often than not is the women that tend to stay home with their children, which means that they're not going to work in the security sector. So you just see less women actually in the security sector. I'm saying that we have seen it yet, but there's a potential that might happen, and that's something I think we need to look into more and analyze that.
Can I just make one comment? And this really predates 1325, but I think it was a really important issue when you think about the behavior of men in war. In the former Yugoslavia wars, for the first time ever, rape was classified as a war crime. That was a huge issue. It was a huge issue. And so you have to kind of basically think about, what else can you do in order to make it accountable, that when people's behaviors.
Okay, perfect. So I think with that, we will wrap up, as we're already a little bit over. I'm sorry I didn't get to everyone's questions today, but I think we got a lot of really good conversation. So I want to thank the panelists a lot for taking your time. It was really nice hearing sort of the international perspective from Angela, perspective from regional organization coming from Martin, and from civil society from CLARA. So I think it was a really good conversation. So I want to thank all of you again for taking the time to speak with us today. I want to thank all of the participants and attendees for joining us today. The IAP will be holding more interviews and live webinars in the coming weeks, so please stay tuned for those. But in the meantime, I hope you all have a pleasant evening, and thank you again so much for taking part in this today. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Thanks. And thanks to the audience.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
And the event will be recorded online so everyone can see in future. Okay. Bye.